So we need some storage in our living room. And I decided, well, I'm making something for storage. I might as well make something that is useful that we can sit on as well. So I found some plans on the internet, and I'll make sure to link those in the description below. I will be making a few modifications, which I will note in my video and also in the descriptions below. So let's get started. So I started off by cutting the 2x4s to make the base. I used the table saw to just cut off the rounded part on the edges, and my board got a little crazy on me there, so hopefully yours doesn't do that. We don't want to lose any fingers. Then I went over to the miter saw and I cut 45s. And although I didn't show it, I used the biscuit joiner to drill holes in all of the edges to make it fit together nice. And I apologize, I do show myself using it later on, but I just forgot here. So I used number 20 size biscuits, and I used glue, wood glue, to hold everything together. And if I had to do this over again, I would not use those for putting together the 45s. It made it rather difficult because biscuits give you just a little bit of wiggle room, which is nice elsewhere, but I would have used my doweling jig. Now you can use Kreg jigs, a doweling jig. There's many different joinery techniques that you can use. Then I used my square just to make sure that everything was square and aligned correctly, as this will be the base that everything sits on. And I clamped it together for the glue to dry. Next, using the miter saw, I cut my 1x6s for the sides, the front and back panels, the top and the bottom. Now this part I would suggest, I joined all of the edges of the boards. This made them fit together nicely and flush without any gaps. Again, it's not necessary, but if you have one, definitely use it. Once I had one side joined on all the boards, I took the untrue side and I ran it through the table saw so that they were all the same width. Next, I put the boards together as they'll be in their panel, and I marked each board where I want the biscuit joint to go. I clamped down the wood and I used the biscuit joiner. And then I lightly sanded just to remove any of the edges that weren't going to fit together flush. Next, I used some wood glue and number 20 biscuits. And I fit the boards in together. Then I followed the same process with the third board. After I got all three done, I put them together, tried to make sure that they were lined up really good, and I clamped them all together. Now I used clamps with a board just to make sure that it wasn't going to make the boards bow. And then I wiped off all remaining glue. I also pulled off the board, wiped all the glue, and put them back on, just to make sure I wasn't gluing that board to it. After it was done, I used a hand planer to remove any of the extra glue. Then I used 150 grit sandpaper just to make sure that the project was completely smooth and had a really nice finish. Then I started by putting together the sides and the front and the back panels. To do this, I used a 3/32 screw bit and drilled first just to make sure that there wasn't any splitting with the wood. And then I used a countersink bit so that my screw head would fit flush with the wood. And I used 1 1/4 inch screws. Now I want to make sure that the screws are flush because they will be covered up by trim boards. And if they're sticking out, the trim boards won't fit flush. Now I had a little bit of bowing happening here, so I used the clamp just to hold it in tight while I went and put in the screw. Next I cut the bottom so that it would fit snug in the bottom of the box. And I placed the box over the top of it and did the same process for the screws on the bottom just to hold that in place. Then I put the box on top of the frame. Then I used tape to mark where the 2x4s were because I wanted to make sure to screw the box into the 2x4s along the bottom. Next, I took the 1x4s and I cut them for the trim pieces. I cut the edges at 45s so that they would fit together flush. Now these I made to fit, so I made sure to measure each one before cutting it, and I used wood glue and 1-inch brads to hold the boards in place. For the top one I used clamps to hold it in place. After I was done with the trim boards, I went through with 150 grit sandpaper and I sanded down the whole project just to get any rough edges out and just to make it all smooth. Next I used the hand plane and a sander on the top, and I made really sure that the top was a nice smooth finish. And I used my router just to give it a nice edge all along the top. And again, I used the sander with 150 grit sandpaper just to smooth out any rough edges. I cut a scrap piece of plywood that I had, and then I cut my 1x3s with 45s to fit that plywood, so they will be the edges to my drawer. Then I used glue and held that in place with clamps, and used my doweling jig to hold the sides onto that drawer. And I continued this process for all 4 sides. Then sadly I forgot to show this, but I cut my 1x3s just slightly larger than the drawer, and I pre-drilled and screwed them in place. Then I used Minwax, English chestnut, and stained the entire project. I took the time and stained the inside as well, as I feel that really gives it a complete nice finish. And then I followed up with 3 coats of polyurethane using 600 grit sandpaper in between. I know that this bench is going to get used a lot, so I wanted to make sure that it had a good protective coating over it. I put on a 30-inch hinge. I pre-drilled and I used the screws that came with the hinge. Then, holding the top in place, I screwed the hinge onto the box. And then I attached my decorative hardware. So here's my finished bench, and I could not be happier with how it turned out. I really love how it looks in here, and it's totally functional. My kids have been sitting here reading their books a lot, so there's extra seating in our living room now, and the storage is amazing. Let me show you this. So there's storage in everything in here, as well as I just love how this drawer pulls out and you can keep all the little stuff that would get lost normally in the toy box. Now, one thing that I did not show you was that I some soft close hinges for the side so that it wouldn't just fall on its own, or there wasn't the risk of putting it up and having it fall on my kids' fingers. So I will be linking those down below, so I would advise getting those as well. But other than that, everything was perfect. I love it.